Currently, education and intellectual life in the United States and many other countries are being destroyed by the triple plague of political correctness, postmodernism, and the so-called deconstructionism. After the collapse of Marxism in much of the world, the forces of evil in philosophy and epistemology are now increasingly arrayed under the banner of deconstructionism, which offers a place of regroupment for fascists, communists, irrationalists, and bankrupt ideologues of every sort. So if you were wondering what the face of the enemy looked like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this is it. The leading purveyor of destructionism is the Frenchman Jacques Derrida. He is now unquestionably the most celebrated and influential academic philosopher in the world today. As I will try to show, the continued intellectual hegemony of deconstructionism in schools and universities amounts to a death sentence for human civilization as we have known it. Deconstructionism in the academy and in government is a direct threat to the lives of a very large portion of the 5.3 billion human beings now inhabiting this planet. But as we survey the contemporary intellectual postage, it is clear that no one but ourselves is qualified or interested in combating the frauds and charlatans of deconstructionism. So in this sense, LaRouche's attack on deconstruction is the decisive intellectual engagement of the close of the 20th century. A couple of aspects of the problem. The modern campus is now the bastion of euphemism and absurd circumlocution. Marx had demagogically promised that his philosophy would change the world. The deconstructionists only want to change all the names. There is no more right or wrong, good or evil. There is only appropriate and inappropriate. Language is supposedly being purged of ableism, ageism, borealocentrism, ethnocentricity, Eurocentricity, hegemonism, heightism, logocentrism, lookism, phallocentrism, racism, sexism, scentism, and smellism. Nobody is fat anymore. You only possess an alternative body image. Those who don't have as much hair as they used to cannot be called bald. They have to be known as follicularly challenged. Or differently hirsute. To be dirty is now to be hygienically challenged. To be tall is to be vertically endowed. If you're old, take comfort in the fact that you are chronologically gifted. Now, it will be noted that this supposed rebellion afflicts language with all the horrors of the worst Pentagon bureaucratic prose. Remember the collateral damage of the Gulf War, when targets were serviced, killing innocent civilians. And of course, ethnic cleansing is nothing but a politically correct term for genocide. Political correctness offers no hope for the homeless, but it does demand that they be called underhoused, involuntarily undomiciled, or houseless. The jobless become non-renewed. So you can see that political correctness is a form of radical nominalism, in which the verbal signs take the place of ideas and things. And as always, this radical nominalism is never very far from paranoid schizophrenia, from the outright mental disease where the victim believes that by changing a name or a sign, he or she has altered reality itself. If we go back to Baroque Europe and think of Lily, Marino, or what was known in France as préciosité, these ways of talking are harbingers of the collapse of civilizations, then and now. Political correctness demands that no one should be offended by any criticism of their depraved or backward prejudices. LaRouche, of course, would counter that the essence of education must always be polemical, that without offending somebody, somehow, there can be no education at all. Political correctness also insists that everything in human affairs can be reduced to race, sex, sometimes called gender, socioeconomic class, and choice of sexual perversion, known as sexual orientation. The New York Times now recognizes a minimum of 5 sexes. But the coprophiles and the sadomasochists are insisting on their rights. Notice that the pessimistic litany of political correctness is strictly determinist. It denies humanity any freedom. You are, they say, what your race, sex, class, and choice of perversion have made you, and you are a slave to that. There is no freedom. The universality of the human personality, which is one of LaRouche's central concepts of writing and politics, is flatly denied. There can therefore be, for the deconstructionist, no such thing as an imago viva Dei to express the creative faculties that all human beings share. Countries that permit deconstructionists to assume power over the government, and that has gone quite far in the United States, as we'll show, such countries are not likely to survive. Political correctness attempts to define a canon of what is to be studied, and it seeks to purge this canon of the dead white European males in favor of Rigoberta Menchú, Frantz Fanon, Jean Genet, or Antonin Artaud. As LaRouche has pointed out, this is a demand to wipe out the progress made by science in Western continental Europe, in particular Germany, France, Italy, Holland, and other countries, since the Italian Golden Renaissance of the 1400s. If Nicholas Cusanus, Leonardo da Vinci, Kepler, Leibniz, Monge, Gauss, Pasteur, Riemann, Cantor, and the other Platonics were to be wiped out, we could no longer maintain the survival of the 5.3 billion human beings of today. Without the scientific achievements of these dwems, the relative potential population density of the world would fall back to the level of the 1300s, back to the time of the bubonic plague. We might go all the way back to the Roman Empire. Most of the 5.3 billion who manage to hang on today, somehow, would be simply doomed. We must therefore underline that deconstructionism is a philosophy of genocide. It is proposing and implementing the most colossal genocide in human history. And we must also stress as the antidote to that LaRouche's concept of relative potential population density and the increase of the population density through realized scientific discovery. It is here that we can find sources and grounding for concepts of value, knowledge, and truth that are now the only alternatives to the deconstructionist madness. Now, many people who observe the lunatic pageant of the modern campus may conclude that the professors and administrators are all crazy, and of course so they are. But there is a method in the madness. Their demands are not purely arbitrary. There is a kind of philosophical system or doctrine which dictates the specific issues raised by political correctness. One generic name for this is postmodernism, which claims that the raving irrationalists, Voltaire, Rousseau, and the rest of the Enlightenment, they say that was the age of reason, but now we're in the age of unreason. We've turned away from those guys, and now we have unreason. So this is POMO, and as you can see, the POMO is quite confused. We could propose the slogan for students on campus, no mo POMO. Now, at the heart of this POMO is deconstructionism. Deconstructionism began its triumphal march through American universities in 1966, when Derrida appeared at Johns Hopkins to tell American academics that the structuralism of Levi-Strauss was dead and that the future belonged to deconstructionism. Derrida is now strongest in the United States of any place in the world. He is stronger in the Anglo-American sphere than in his native France. He is dominant, or at least very strong, in much of Ibero-America, Francophone Africa, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and other areas. And in the United States, If you want tenure, if you want an endowed chair, if you want a financial grant from the government, government financing, the National Endowment of the Humanities, you have to learn to talk a kind of pedantic deconstructionist gibberish. Now, deconstructionists are, in a way, like the cynics and skeptics of the ancient world. They are like Diogenes and Pyrrho, because they refuse to profess or affirm a doctrine of their own, but they tend rather to negate the ideas of others. Deconstructionism is very eclectic, and I would suggest that we could compare Derrida's world of ideas to a kind of a great sewer, if we could have the first slide. The sewer of deconstructionism. No, it's the, there you go. You can think of the world of ideas of Derrida. You see, of course, when deconstructionists arrive, then la mer can never be too far away. You can compare his world of ideas to a great sewer into which empty the various gutters and waste channels of the past 2 or 3 centuries. Each of these channels contributes in its own way to the great cloaca maxima, the central sewer of deconstruction, as this slide shows. And of course, one of the things that we're reviewing here is the disastrous degradation of much human intellectual life of the past couple of centuries as we go towards the year 2000. Now, let's just look at a couple of these things. Most basic for Derrida are perhaps Descartes and Rousseau, the French disease specifically, transmitted through these sadistic institutions, the École Normale Supérieure and the other government parts of the government school system, of which Derrida is a typical creature. Secondly, we have the skepticism of Hume. Hume started out from Paolo Sarpi's notion of sense impressions, and then ended up denying the world, himself, causality, and all hope of knowledge. Derrida simply uses texts in the way that Hume used sense impressions, and then follows the same path. Thirdly, we have the mystifications of the Hegelian dialectic, also present, mediated through such teachers of Derrida as Jean Hippolyte and Alexandre Kojève. Derrida is, of course, an important ardent follower of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who proclaimed that God is dead and that the Superman, by his superior will to power, can put himself beyond all morality. Nietzsche is, of course, the classic proto-fascist of the 19th century. Nietzsche's problem, partly to do with the cerebral syphilis, not cerebral at the beginning, but ultimately syphilis of the brain. He spent about a dozen years of his life in a kind of a catatonic trance. And once upon a time, Nietzsche's colleague, Jakob Burckhardt, professor at Basel, came upon Nietzsche sitting in a room which he had smeared the walls with his own excrement, busily masturbating. For Derrida, Nietzsche is, of course, a touchstone. And this influence is reinforced through Michel Foucault, as we're going to see in a minute. Now, Derrida has never ignored Marx. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Derrida announced in 1990 that he would focus more on Marx. It's obviously a maneuver to get the Marxists regrouping around deconstructionism. Marx was, of course, a British agent on the Mazzini-Bakunin model controlled by Mr. Urquhart of the British Museum. Derrida's Marx is mediated by the structuralist Althusser. Perhaps the greatest guru for Derrida is Martin Heidegger, who came out as a raving Nazi in 1933, signing his letters Heil Hitler, raving against non-Aryans, and so forth. Among Heidegger's discoveries, we have, for example, the fact that human beings are going to die, that we are beings towards death. He also discovered that nothingness annihilates, or nichts nichtet, and so forth. Right? If they ask you how old you are, if you happen to be 47, say minus 47, because whatever you started out with, it's that much less. So this is Heidegger. It's existentialism, the worst kind. Derrida came to Heidegger through a man called Manuel Levinas, who supported Heidegger during his Nazi phase. There's also the influence there of Jean-Paul Sartre, who, of course, died, as Simone de Beauvoir tells us now, a pro-terrorist, alcoholic pederast. Then we have Sigmund Freud, a homosexual morphine addict, Kabbalist mystic of B'nai B'rith, who genially reduced everything to sex drives, death instincts, and so forth. Derrida's Freud comes filtered through a certain Jacques Lacan, L-A-C-A-N, a Parisian author who has been responsible for many fallacies. This list would not be complete without structuralism, especially as represented by Lévi-Strauss, the head of the school of anthropologists who claimed that since all human societies have the same structures, such as kinship and so forth, a village of mud huts is just as good as the Athens of Solon and Socrates. Structuralists have, of course, been in the forefront of the terrorism of the so-called indigenous peoples from Pol Pot to Sendero Luminoso. The other element that we have there is the transcendental phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. A couple of words about that perhaps later. Now, Jacques Derrida is the endlessly pedantic, endlessly long-winded expositor of all of the above. Derrida's immediate lineage is equally abominable, as the next slide shows us. The next slide. Okay. Althusser, Foucault, Derrida. Three professors at the École Normale Supérieure, ENS. Each taught the other in a kind of Parisian grand guignol of the history of ideas. First of all, Althusser. He was a structuralist Marxist who was already suffering from mental breakdowns in the late 1940s. In 1980, he murdered his own wife by strangling her, but he escaped a trial and possibly the guillotine by commitment to an insane asylum. His student, he recruited a young provincial pederast named Michel Foucault, a leading light of postmodernism in his own right. Foucault's time at the ENS alternated between attempted suicide and attempted homicide. Foucault started off as a Nietzschean Marxist and allegedly was a speechwriter, a ghostwriter for Jean Canapat of the Politburo of the Stalinist French Communist Party. Foucault has developed the doctrine that we are all deviants. This was picked up by R.D. Laing and other exponents of anti-psychiatry and used in their cost-cutting campaign to shut down the mental hospitals. The mentally ill who were thrown out on the streets to become homeless and to freeze to death can thank Foucault. Foucault later became a Maoist. He preached mass extermination on the Pol Pot model. And later in his life, in the 70s, he discovered the San Francisco Nazis in leather sadomaso scene at such dens of perversion as the Barracks in the Folsom District. He went on LSD trips in Death Valley. He frequented gay bars long after he had become aware that he had contracted AIDS, deliberately infected others, and finally died of AIDS in 1984. In his last phase, he elaborated his own similarity to the cynic philosopher Diogenes, for reasons that undoubtedly include the approval by Diogenes of counterfeiting, cannibalism, incest, and the practice of public masturbation. In Foucault's book, Les mots et les choses, or The Order of Things, Foucault predicted that all notions of mankind and humanity were destined to be effaced, like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea when the tide comes in. So humanity is on its way out. Now, Derrida. Foucault was the teacher of Derrida at the ENS. Foucault took Derrida with him to visit the inmates at the mental hospital of St. Anne. Derrida has been somewhat less publicly flamboyant than Foucault, but he is no less of an irrationalist. He's probably a more effective one. He is the child of a Sephardic Jewish family living in Algeria. He was very young, Derrida, when he had the experience of being buried alive. He was locked in a coffin-shaped cedar chest by his sister. He later managed to escape alive, but he was traumatized by the belief that he had died and been brought back from the dead. From this grew his identification with the Isis-Osiris myth. in which Isis, of course, brings Osiris back from the dead. But this also implied for Derrida an obsession with castration, which he told his students had suggested to him the title for one of his early books, Disseminations. Derrida's irrationalism was later fueled by the mystical writings of the Kabbalah, very important, and by his devotion to the satanic degenerate Artaud of the Theater of Cruelty, some people may remember. This Artaud was somebody who spent about a decade of his own life in a mental institution. Derrida was jailed in 1981 by the Czechoslovakian communist regime on charges of drug trafficking, but these charges were never proven. Some of the best one-liners about Derrida come from Foucault during the period when these two were quarreling during the 1970s. Foucault said that Derrida was a terrorist and an obscurantist who deliberately wrote in such a way as to be impossible to understand, so he could then lash out at his critics as cretins who were incapable of understanding the profoundness of his thought. The best summary from Foucault: Derrida is the kind of philosopher who gives bullshit a bad name. Now, we can turn the lights on. We don't need this at the moment. We have one more. Derrida's opaque doctrines are a philosophy of Anglo-American destabilization from the word go. His big publishing breakthroughs came in 1967, and key lectures were delivered at the height of the May 1968 riots that led to the overthrow of General Charles de Gaulle, the best government that France had seen in many ages. Derrida was a leading light of the clique around the magazine Tel Quel, which was one of the theoretical mouthpieces of this rebellion. Now, deconstruction. Deconstruction is an attack on the Judeo-Christian Western European civilization. It is an attack that is powered above all by rage. Derrida hates and resents reason and creativity. And these he identifies with the epoch of Christian creationism and infinitism, when these appropriate the resources of Greek conceptuality. That is from his book on grammatology. In other words, Derrida hates Plato, he hates apostolic Christianity as exemplified by St. John, St. Paul, St. Augustine, and other patristic writers. He hates the entire edifice of Western civilization based on Christian Platonism. And in this he follows mentors like Nietzsche, who claimed to be Socrates in reverse, or Diogenes, who defined himself as Socrates gone mad. Most of all, Derrida hates the logos. This in the Greek means word or discussion, perhaps ordering, lawfulness, but finally reason. The logos is reason. In Plato's dialogues, the spoken word is the path to refining and improving the logos or reason. Later, Christ came into the world as the Word of God. And in another moment of the Christian Trinity, the Holy Spirit is the logos which proceeds from the Son of God and which abides with human beings. Derrida wishes to reject all of this and all of the implications. Derrida says that Western European culture is guilty of logocentrism. The Western cultural paradigm has contained within it the aspiration to be based on reason. This has to be rejected. The Western cultural paradigm also gives priority to speech and to the spoken word. You can compare this to other cultures around the world, but this is not the case. Most literature was originally designed to be read aloud or even sung, from Plato's dialogues to Dante to Chaucer to Shakespeare to Schiller. And this is the hated phonocentrism, which Derrida also wants to get rid of. Derrida delves into Plato in an attempt to show that the overtones of the Platonic logos are exclusively paternal and male-dominated. This gives rise to the further charge of phallogocentrism. And of course, soon enough, that turns into phallocentrism in the writings of the maenads of feminist literary theory today. Derrida follows his Nazi guru Heidegger in concluding that the real problem in the West is that our culture is permeated by what he calls metaphysics. Heidegger had railed against the metaphysics of presence and against metaphysics in general. For Derrida, metaphysics evidently means anything that cannot be boiled down to sense certainty. Derrida sees metaphysics as the enemy that must be destroyed. And under this heading, he lumps God, the self, the soul, the human individual, causality, substance, essence, idea, action, and virtually any concept of any importance turns out to be metaphysical. These have to go, of course, for reasons that are never really explained. And of course, for Derrida, language is this self-contained formal system of signs with no connection to any reality, concept, or thing. Back during the Weimar Republic in the 20s and 30s in Germany, the pro-Nazi Heidegger and others referred to their battle against metaphysics with the name destruction, or destruction. And destruction was the first name that Derrida ever gave to his own method. Parallels have been drawn from deconstructionism to Zen, and above all to the Sufism of Al-Ghazali, whose destruction is in effect a deconstruction of Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, attempting to play on their supposed self-contradictions. And writers on postmodernism have called attention to this. A dozen years ago, LaRouche authored a new standard American English curriculum for effective U.S. public schools, in which he outlined the requirements for a literate language, setting out to express the geometric complexity of reality. According to LaRouche, this would include 7 grammatical cases, 9 tenses, 5 moods, an active and passive voice, non-reflexive and self-reflexive features, and a vocabulary of 50,000 to 100,000 words, including a very well-developed verb system. This would therefore mean the ability to express at least 1,260 degrees of geometric freedom. But of course, for the radical nominalist, paranoid, schizophrenic Derrida, language has nothing to do with reality. LaRouche's geometric requirements for literate language were rooted in the efforts of Dante and Petrarca to create languages as the necessary premises for nation building. See Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia. LaRouche was also in the German tradition of historical philology, associated with Wilhelm von Humboldt, Franz Bopp, and the Grimms. Derrida is a part of the adversary school that grew up in the linguistic school of Geneva. This Geneva school was designed to combat the influence of German historical philology. Derrida sides above all with the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure of Geneva, which accomplished a massive deterioration in these language studies by abandoning all idea of historical analysis. For Saussure and Derrida, the word as a sign does not lead to a concept or an object, but it only leads you to other signs. Take, for example, the word cat. Okay, cat as a word leads you to the furry feline, right? But no. According to de Saussure, this word by itself can mean nothing. It only means something because it's different from other words, like bat or rat or hat. It's therefore a negative and relational axiom of de Saussure. For Derrida, the word seems to promise meaning, but its definition always sends us through an endless chain of other words when we look for the definitions. So the promise of meaning is indefinitely postponed, delayed, deferred, according to this nonsense. Each word in a text points to a never-ending series of other older texts. Chamber of texts of Derrida. This is Derrida's jargon word of différence, with a big A in the last syllable, which packs difference and delay into the same baggage. Now, for Derrida, the author is dead by definition. He never existed. The human self and the human ego have collapsed into an X, marking the spot where they once were. This is the so-called subject position. There is no perception. All that Derrida is willing to talk about is a text, a written text of black on white, with punctuation, typefaces, paragraphs, margins, colophons, copyrights, logos, but no logos, and so forth. This is what he calls writing, or l'écriture. And this writing is primary over speech, primary respect to the spoken word, which is another purely arbitrary and absolutely absurd assertion. Everything is a written text in the sense that every thought, utterance, or discourse, watch out when you hear discourse, because that's them. Any discourse is simply a story that we tell each other about something that exists. Something that may or may not exist. And the best way for a discourse to be there is as a written text. So as Derrida says, there is nothing outside of the text. Everything is a text. There are no more works of art. All black writing on white paper is a text, be it Shakespeare, the telephone book, Mickey Mouse, the racing form, the U.S. Constitution, the Jupiter Symphony, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. All of those are texts, and every one of them is exactly equivalent to any other. As you can see, what Derrida tries to do is to draw you into a labyrinth of jargon. He's always shifting the jargon, allegedly to keep from falling back into the hated ways of metaphysics. He uses words like trace, sediment, and iteration to show that words evolve and change their meanings as they are used again and again. It's like barnacles on a ship's hull, or the way a coin might be worn when it goes through circulation. For example, if we hear the word crook, who do we think of? Think of maybe recent U.S. presidents. It's a hint. Nixon. All right, Nixon. Well, Nixon. I think Nixon is the one. However, if we think of malaise. Carter. Thank you. Good. Very a little bit well-educated group. The malaise, right? The Jimmy Carter's malaise. How about prudent? It's clear. So the idea is that each one of these words becomes freighted with a trace, a sediment of something because of the way that they've been used, and this is always there and may not be under control. It's clear enough. These are overtones, connotations, associations. You can think of them as etymologies if you want to. They become the key to Derrida's practice of what he calls dissemination, the scattering of meanings through free play. The point is always to show that writing is the product of some kind of a compulsion, some kind of a determinism. It is not free. One example is Derrida's deconstruction of his favorite target, Plato. If we could have the next overhead here. This is the deconstruction of the Phaedrus dialogue in the book Disseminations by Derrida. Derrida attempts to show, through a textual analysis of the dialogue, words that Plato uses. One is pharmakeia. This is a proper name. It is a nymph who was present when one of her companions was blown off a cliff and died on the rocks below. Then we have the word pharmakon. This can mean either a medicine which gives life or a poison which gives death. Then we have pharmakeus. Plato refers to Socrates as pharmakeus. It has the overtone of a sorcerer or a medicine man, used ironically. Derrida points out that although Plato goes through this series, pharmakeia, pharmakon, pharmakeus, he does not use a closely related word, which is a synonym of the last one, which is pharmakos. And pharmakos is the sacrificial victim or scapegoat. This is the person, for example, who would be ceremonially killed in Athens in the event of a plague or some other natural disaster or some disaster of another type. So scapegoat is, of course, what Socrates later became. So Derrida goes through this with the idea of showing you that Plato was also not free. He was compelled. He was controlled by some kinds of subconscious psychological factors. And therefore, the text says what Plato could not have meant. And this is the obvious deconstructionist conclusion. All reading is misreading. The Phaedrus dialogue and any other piece of writing is hopelessly contradictory and completely indecipherable. So much for that. The crowning moment of deconstruction is what we see here, the discovery of aporia. The aporia, or hopeless contradiction and confusion, in one or more key words of a text. Now, aporia is a very old trick. The aporia is the embarrassment when you can't decide which way it's supposed to go. This old trick was known to Zeno. Zeno was, of course, adept in proving anything and the opposite of anything. Derrida believes again that language is at bottom a purely formal structure which can be completely disrupted if a word turns out to have more than one meaning. And one postmodernist writer makes the case, he tries to praise Derrida by saying that Derrida is doing for language what Gödel's proof has done for mathematics. So you can see the way these arguments are cooked up. For Derrida, the moment of aporia opens the door to throwing all writing into hell. This is the so-called mise en abîme, the throwing of the text into the abyss. The Western Platonic tradition, which thought that it had solid ground under its feet, he claims, falls through the floor. No writing means anything, as Nietzsche said, and there is no meaning to be discovered. Derrida has occasionally revealed that he sees the future under the heading of monstrosity. He invites his followers not to be nostalgic about the lost world of meaning and communication, but rather to imitate the Nietzschean Superman in his attitude of nonchalance and to dance the Dionysiac dance outside of the house of reason. There are no meanings. The deconstructionists can therefore feel free to impose whatever meaning they like through an active force that will attest to their superior will to power. And this is what is now happening on the campus. Remember that a deconstructionist can, by definition, have no morality. There was Professor Paul DeMann of Yale, the so-called boa deconstructor. He could crush anything. The boa deconstructor Paul DeMann wrote that any action exists on two levels: as fictional discourse, watch out, discourse, as fictional discourse, and as an empirical event. So if you commit a war crimes atrocity, you can simply define that as a fictional discourse, and you've solved it. It was very interesting that after the death of Demant, it became widely known that he had written pro-Nazi editorials in the Le Soir newspaper of Brussels during the occupation of World War II. Now, Derrida likes to dish it out. Let's see for a moment if he can take it. It happens that Derrida's first important publication deals not with literary criticism at all, but with the origin of geometry. This is Derrida's 1962 translation and introduction to Edmund Husserl's The Origin of Geometry. All of Derrida's characteristic modus operandi is present in this short 1936 piece by the phenomenologist Husserl. Derrida, of course, has never had an original idea in his life, but by looking into this, we can see how Derrida's pathological inability to conceptualize creativity leads to the vile results that we have now summarized. Husserl raises the interesting question of geometry, by which he means mathematical physics, understood as the whole mathematics of space-time. Now, I'm going to be talking about Husserl. You can imagine Derrida as existing within the borders of Husserl. If you can refute Husserl, you've refuted Derrida, since he's inside. For Husserl, of course, the question of the origin of geometry is complicated by the fact that he is looking for a phenomenological explanation. This means a series of mystifications and so forth that are not important for now. Husserl writes, "Science, and in particular geometry, must have had a historical beginning, and this meaning itself must have an origin in an accomplishment, first as project and then in successful execution." Now, why is Husserl interested in this? On the one hand, Husserl wishes to mount an attack on Galileo's notion of mathematical physics, specifically on Galileo's mathematization of nature, in which nature itself is idealized under the guidance of the new mathematics, and nature itself becomes a mathematical manifold. Husserl is not happy with various features of this. At the same time, Husserl wants to be able to reproduce the founding moment of geometry because he thinks that the ability to do this is necessary to the authenticity of current progress in mathematical physics. So Husserl asks, if the researcher of today in physics has to run back through the whole immense chain of groundings back to the original premises and actually reactivate the whole thing, he asks such questions as how, as a systematic, endlessly growing, stratified structure of reality, physics can maintain its original meaningfulness through living reactivatability if its cognitive thinking is supposed to produce something new without being able to reactivate the previous levels of knowledge back to the first. It's a little bit garbled, but try to follow. A little bit further on, Husserl says, if the premises can actually be reactivated back to the most original self-presence, then their self-evident consequences can also be. Accordingly, it appears that beginning with the primal self-evidences, the original genuineness must propagate itself through the chain of logical inference, no matter how long it is. Now, Husserl regards geometry, physics, mathematical physics, as a deductive science. There are other sciences that he thinks are inductive. And he says, only if the foundations of the deductive structure have truly been produced and objectified in original self-evidence, and only then could geometry preserve its genuine original meaning as a deductive science through the progression of logical constructions. Okay, I hope you get the idea. He wants to go back to the original founding because he thinks you need that for the whole progress of today. Husserl points out that the Pythagorean theorem exists only once, and that the word Löwe, lion, occurs only once in the German language. All right? How can we be sure that the proof we see or the word we hear is the genuine article? Because, Husserl says, there is the free play of associative constructions, sounds like Derrida, and the sedimentations of meaning that come through repeated use, right? It's Derrida again. Husserl concludes that there is no certainty that geometry as mathematical physics can ever be cashed in. Our results, based on principle, are of a generality that extends over all the so-called deductive sciences and even indicates similar problems and investigations for all sciences. For all of them have the mobility of sedimented traditions that are worked upon again and again by an activity of producing new structures of meaning and handing them down. Existing in this way, they extend enduringly through time, since all new acquisitions are in turn sedimented and become working materials. Well, I think it's clear that any hope of new knowledge or illumination that might have been present at the beginning of this inquiry by Husserl has completely disappeared. There are two main failures of Husserl that stand out. First is that Husserl, Derrida a part of this, stubbornly and persistently ignores the necessary act of creative mentation, the process of scientific discovery that has got to be the fountainhead of all knowledge, including geometry, mathematical physics, and so forth. And it is precisely this concept of creativity as the central fact of science and economics, which Larouche's epistemology has always placed at the center of attention. Secondly, Husserl regards science as what Larouche would describe as a single theorem lattice. It's an old, rambling, extended theorem lattice which has been added to over the years, but which still retains, Husserl thinks, all of the original axioms and other parts. Larouche has, of course, repeatedly shown that the progress of science involves the overthrowing of the old axiomatic grounding through the moment of scientific discovery, provided that new axioms are given, create new axioms, and you throw overboard parts of the old theorem lattice. So things like epicycles or phlogiston or the ether go out the window and new ideas come in. But for Husserl, everything is retained and everything is flattened to logical deduction or induction. Now, what Derrida does manage to do is that Husserl's original essay is about 20 pages. The commentary by Derrida is more than 150 pages. So it's 6 times longer. The commentary is the introduction is 6 times longer than the text. It simply gives Derrida repeated opportunities to smash his head against the brick wall, represented by the fact that he lacks any concept of creativity. One typical pathological moment for Derrida comes when he goes back to Kant. He goes back to Kant's remarks on the origins of geometry in the preface to the 2nd edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant is, of course, this nasty, old, evil Aristotelian faker. But Kant talks about the emergence of geometry after a phase of blind groping among the Egyptians. But then, says Kant, it was revolutionized by the happy idea of one man. A new light must have flashed on in the mind of the first man, Thales or whoever he had been, who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle. A light going on in your head. Well, that is, of course, the most common of all the naive descriptions of the actual experience of creativity. And if Derrida had had any access to this, he might have begun to say something about the role of creativity. But notice that Derrida is absolutely incapable of sustaining any such discussion. He simply spins out his insufferable, long-winded pedantry. He has no concept of creativity. Derrida is a wretchedly truncated, mutilated, pathetic creature, hopelessly blocked, not creative, never funny, incapable of adding anything to this outline provided by Husserl. And of course, Husserl was bad enough in his own right. Derrida is therefore the typical Aristotelian nominalist intellectual who hates and fears real creative reason and who does everything in his power to destroy such reason. As LaRouche has pointed out, the transition from one theorem lattice to the next is accomplished by means of Platonic ideas, thought objects, in LaRouche's sense, Riemann's Geistesmassen, and so forth. Derrida's wretched and shriveled intellect is incapable of any glimmer of understanding of all this, except that LaRouche's epistemology is a threat to shut down Derrida's con job. Deconstruction, in conclusion, can target any of the written documents which are constitutive of civilization itself. Take, for example, theology. Herb Quindy has pointed to a certain Mark C. Taylor, a deconstructionist theologian. Now, if you think about it, deconstructionist theology is quite a tall order because you have a ban on metaphysics, of course, and therefore you're going to have theology without God. You're going to have God is dead, but expressed as theology. This is the point that this character, Taylor, deconstructionist, eagerly seizes on, and he writes, "One of the distinctive features of deconstruction is its willingness to confront the death of God squarely, if not always directly." Nothing is ever direct. It would not be too much to suggest that deconstruction is the hermeneutics, the interpretation of the death of God. And Taylor's program is the death of God, the erasure of the self, and the end of history. Remember that for deconstruction, all writing is the same. It can be unleashed in the field of law with devastating effect. Listen for just one moment to Claire Dalton, formerly of the Critical Legal Studies Group at Harvard Law School. Law, writes Dalton, like every other cultural institution, is a place where we tell one another stories about our relationships with ourselves, one another, and authority. This is from Mrs. Dalton's paper, An Essay on the Deconstruction of Contract Doctrine. Sanford Levinson of the University of Texas at Austin chimes in. The death of constitutionalism may be the central event of our time, just as the death of God was that of the past century, and for much the same reason. You can see what it is. You take habeas corpus, due process, and they tell you it's all aporia. Projected on the plane of cosmology, deconstructionism would have to give rise to something akin to the chaos theory now fashionable in certain postmodern sectors of physics. And then we have the French feminist Luce Irigaray, who argues that science is phallocratic, that phallocratic science may work for solids, but cannot explain the behavior of fluids. since these are more feminine. 10 more lines. The Clinton White House is, of course, redolent of deconstructionism and political correctness. The Clinton cabinet is completely dysfunctional, but it does respect the distributive requirement of race, sex, class, sexual perversion. And other deconstructionists are also there. Maya Angelou recited a poem at the inauguration. She is a leading politically correct writer. We have Donna Shalala of the Health and Human Services, who helped to promulgate a code on offensive speech at the University of Wisconsin. And then we have Hillary Clinton's personal guru of the past 20 years, Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund, who is also aligned with the new doctrine. So is Laura Tyson of the Council of Economic Advisors, who talks about economics as discourse. Watch out. Vice President Gore's favorite book is reportedly Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which has become a kind of manual for all New Age paradigm shifters. So I would conclude in appealing to all persons who share our regard for the potential of the human mind to join us in exposing and defeating the deconstructionists. Thank you. Of the dead white European males in favor of Rigoberta Menchú, Frantz Fanon, Jean Genet, or Antonin Artaud. As LaRouche has pointed out, this is a demand to wipe out the progress made by science in Western continental Europe, in particular Germany, France, Italy, Holland, and other countries, since the Italian Golden Renaissance of the 1400s. If Nicholas Cusanus, Leonardo da Vinci, Kepler, Leibniz, Monge, Gauss, Pasteur, Riemann, Cantor, and the other Platonics were to be wiped out, we could no longer maintain the survival of the 5.3 billion human beings of today. Without the scientific achievements of these duems, the relative potential population density of the world would fall back to the level of the 1300s, back to the time of the bubonic plague. We might go all the way back to the Roman Empire. Most of the 5.3 billion who manage to hang on today, somehow, would be simply doomed. We must therefore underline that deconstructionism is a philosophy of genocide. It is proposing and implementing the most colossal genocide in human history. And we must also stress as the antidote to that, LaRouche's concept of relative potential population density and the increase of the population density through realized scientific discovery. It is here that we can find sources and grounding for concepts of value, knowledge, and truth. Currently, education and intellectual life in the United States and many other countries are being destroyed by the triple plague of political correctness, postmodernism, and the so-called deconstructionism. After the collapse of Marxism in much of the world, the forces of evil in philosophy and epistemology are now increasingly arrayed under the banner of deconstructionism, which offers a place of regroupment for fascists, communists, irrationalists, and bankrupt ideologues of every sort. So if you were wondering what the face of the enemy looked like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this is it. The leading purveyor of destructionism is the Frenchman Jacques Derrida. He is now unquestionably the most celebrated and influential academic philosopher in the world today. As I will try to show, the continued intellectual hegemony of deconstructionism in schools and universities amounts to a death sentence for human civilization as we have known it. Deconstructionism in the academy and in government is a direct threat to the lives of a very large portion of the 5.3 billion human beings now inhabiting this planet. But as we survey the contemporary intellectual postage, or postage, it is clear that no one but ourselves is qualified or interested in combating the frauds and depraved or backward prejudices. LaRouche, of course, would counter that the essence of education must always be polemical, that without offending somebody, somehow, there can be no education at all. Political correctness also insists that everything in human affairs can be reduced to race, sex, sometimes called gender, socioeconomic class, and choice of sexual perversion, known as sexual orientation. The New York Times now recognizes a minimum of 5 sexes. But the coprophiles and the sadomasochists are insisting on their rights. Notice that the pessimistic litany of political correctness is strictly determinist. It denies humanity any freedom. You are, they say, what your race, sex, class, and choice of perversion have made you, and you are a slave to that. There is no freedom. The universality of the human personality, which is one of LaRouche's central concepts of writing and politics, is flatly denied. There can therefore be, for the deconstructionists, no such thing as an imago viva Dei to express the creative faculties that all human beings share. Countries that permit deconstructionists to assume power over the government, and that has gone quite far in the United States, as we'll show, such countries are not likely to survive. Political correctness attempts to define a canon of what is to be studied, and it seeks to purge this canon. If you're old, take comfort in the fact that you are chronologically gifted. Now, it will be noted that this supposed rebellion afflicts language with all the horrors of the worst Pentagon bureaucratic prose. Remember the collateral damage of the Gulf War, when targets were serviced, killing innocent civilians. And of course, ethnic cleansing is nothing but a politically correct term for genocide. Political correctness offers no hope for the homeless, but it does demand that they be called underhoused, involuntarily undomiciled, or houseless. The jobless become non-renewed. So you can see that political correctness is a form of radical nominalism, in which the verbal signs take the place of ideas and things. And as always, this radical nominalism is never very far from paranoid schizophrenia, from the outright mental disease where the victim believes that by changing a name or a sign, he or she has altered reality itself. If we go back to Baroque Europe and think of Lily, Marino, or what was known in France as préciosité, these ways of talking are harbingers of the collapse of civilizations, then and now. Political correctness demands that no one should be offended by any criticism of their charlatans of deconstructionism. So in this sense, LaRouche's attack on deconstruction is the decisive intellectual engagement of the close of the 20th century. A couple of aspects of the problem. The modern campus is now the bastion of euphemism and absurd circumlocution. Marx had demagogically promised that his philosophy would change the world. The deconstructionists only want to change all the names. There is no more right or wrong, good or evil. There is only appropriate and inappropriate. Language is supposedly being purged of ableism, ageism, borealocentrism, ethnocentricity, Eurocentricity, hegemonism, heightism, logocentrism, lookism, phallocentrism, racism, sexism, scentism, and smellism. Nobody is fat anymore. You only possess an alternative body image. Those who don't have as much hair as they used to cannot be called bald. They have to be known as follicularly challenged, or differently hirsute. To be dirty is now to be hygienically challenged. To be tall is to be vertically endowed.